Welcome to today's Explainer. You know, if you've ever watched a massive product launch that looked like an absolute slam dunk on the surface, but was somehow still bleeding cash behind the scenes, well, you are certainly not alone. Today, we're going on a rescue mission for your profit margins. We're going to explore how traditional accounting might actually be setting your new products up to fail right out of the gate, and exactly what you can do to flip the script. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with 1, the traditional costing trap, then 2, target costing, top-down pricing, 3, closing the cost gap, 4, the product lifecycle, 5, tracking cradle to grave, and finally 6, strategic advantages and limits. Section 1, the traditional costing trap and the flaw of internal focus. So, to really fix our margins, we first need to understand the fundamental flaw in how most companies operate. And it's this dangerous habit of looking internally at the factory first, rather than looking externally at the market. See, the conventional approach to product costing is entirely bottom-up and internally focused. You basically build a product, add up all your direct materials, your labor, your overhead, you slap a desired profit margin on top of all that, and hey, that becomes your selling price. But notice what is completely missing from that equation: the customer. Target costing flips this entirely. It's a top-down approach with a strict external market focus. It starts with market demand and the price your competitors are setting. Traditional costing essentially ignores the outside world until the product is already sitting on the shelf, which, as you can imagine, is a massive risk. And man, the trap gets even deeper when we look at internal costs. Traditional absorption costing tends to severely underallocate overhead costs to low-volume products. Even worse, traditional systems rely heavily on periodic accounts. They report profitability in these isolated, calendar-based chunks, like a monthly or an annual statement. This creates totally dangerous blind spots, essentially hiding the true long-term financial reality of a product by just arbitrarily chopping up its costs. Moving right along to Section 2, target costing, top-down pricing. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the formula itself. Target costing isn't just about frantically trying to cut costs after the fact. It's a completely different proactive equation. A target cost is estimated by taking a competitive market price and subtracting your desired profit margin. Think about what that actually means. The market dictates the cost, not your production line. You are literally locking in your required profit before you even allow the product cost to be finalized. Here's how this simple but incredibly powerful process works in practice. Step 1, you set a target price based entirely on the customer's perceived value of the product. Step 2, you deduct your required level of profit, which, of course, takes into account the return you need on any new investments. And Step 3, you arrive at your absolute target cost. This essentially guarantees a company's profit margin on paper before they build a single thing. Let's anchor this with a real-time scenario straight from our source data. Look at GYE Inc. Instead of just guessing, they proactively interviewed prospective customers to determine exactly why they would buy the product and how they'd actually use it in their daily lives. I mean, would you build a premium consumer electronic device or a high-end tool without knowing if the market sees enough value to actually open their wallets for it? Of course not. GYE Inc. uses this direct customer insight to accurately set that initial market-based target price we were just talking about. All right, Section 3, closing the cost gap, hitting the target cost. Let's be real for a second. What happens when your actual internal production costs are inevitably higher than your shiny new top-down target cost? Well, you have a gap, and you close it using 2 crucial related tools: value analysis and value engineering. While they sound kind of similar, they're applied at completely different times. Value analysis is a systematic examination of an existing product to find ways to reduce costs without ruining its intended use. Value engineering, on the other hand, takes that same principle right back to the drawing board. It tries to design the best possible value at the absolute lowest possible cost into a new product from the very start. All departments have to work jointly using these tools to economically hit that strict target cost. Which brings us to Section 4, the product lifecycle, from inception to end. We are now shifting our focus from how we calculate costs to when. Basically expanding our timeline horizontally across a product's entire existence. And this brilliantly illustrates that journey. Consider the life cycle of, say, a modern video game console or a new electric vehicle. A product passes through distinct stages: development, introduction, growth, maturity, and finally, decline. You can clearly see the massive financial losses accumulating during those years of development and introduction, long before the product ever crosses the line into profitability during its growth and maturity stages. A traditional annual budget, it completely misses this sweeping multi-year reality. So to manage this massive curve effectively, we use lifecycle costing. This method tracks and accumulates actual costs and revenues attributable to each specific product from inception all the way to abandonment. This cradle-to-grave method completely replaces that flawed calendar-based reporting we talked about earlier. Instead of looking at generic period expenses, it traces research, design, and marketing costs to individual products over their entire life cycles, so you can accurately compare them with those much later revenues. Section 5. Tracking cradle to grave for long-term management. Okay, quick question. When do you think the most financial damage is actually done in a product's life? Brace yourself. 90%. That is a staggering number. Our sources indicate that many companies find up to 90% of a product's lifecycle costs are essentially baked in, literally determined by decisions made right at the beginning, in the development and launch stages. Once a product design is finalized, the number of components and the production methods are basically locked in. If you're focusing your cost control efforts only after the product has entered production, you are managing a tiny fraction of the total costs. Which brings us to this really powerful insight straight from the text. Quote, "It is absolutely vital, therefore, that design teams do not work in isolation, but as part of a cross-functional team in order to minimize costs." Tying right back to our earlier point on value engineering, the crucial takeaway here is that tight control over these early, locked-in design costs is the absolute secret to ultimate profitability. If you design a ton of complexity into a product early on, you commit the entire organization to paying for it throughout the product's entire life cycle. Finally, Section 6, Strategic Advantages and Limits, the pros and cons. Let's move to our wrap-up and see how this all builds together, so you leave with a totally balanced view. Lifecycle costing gives us some incredible advantages. For one, it allows us to forecast the profitability of a product over its entire life before production even begins. And for sure, it leads to vastly more effective resource allocation than traditional annual budgets. However, we do have to acknowledge the limits here. It can be a little overly simplistic to assume every single product will perfectly follow that standard bell curve. Plus, in the real world, it's often quite difficult for management to pinpoint exactly where a product currently sits on that lifecycle curve at any given moment. Let's leave things here with a final thought to mull over. If up to 90% of your costs are firmly locked in before production even begins, are you tracking the right numbers? Or are your traditional accounting systems just showing you the history of decisions you can no longer change? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep rethinking those margins, and I'll catch you next time.